Crossroads to Freedom. I would just like to welcome you to Rhodes College. I know you're a figure here anyway, but we'd just like to thank you for giving us your time today to share us your story. So can we start out by you just stating your name?
Sure. So, well, W.J. Michael Cody. Mike Cody.
And where were you born and raised?
Here in Memphis. I was born in 1936. Methodist Hospital, Memphis. Lived on Harbert Street in what's now called Central Gardens. And lived here all through public school. Came here to Rhodes, which was then Southwestern. And didn't leave Memphis until I basically went to law school at the University of Virginia.
So what was it like growing up in that neighborhood?
Well, of course, it was completely segregated. It was a nice life for those of us who were fortunate enough, I guess, to live in a white community and not understand that there was another side of the city that was not as fortunate. About the only African Americans that a young person like myself would see would be a yard person or a maid. You never saw any kids of your own age. But, basically you either walked or rode public transportation, which was at that time, early on, it was streetcars, and then went to electric buses, and then finally to buses. And there was nothing except where people lived in downtown. There was no such thing as a shopping mall or East Memphis or all of the places out that have developed since that time. And my father worked at a place called Standard Oil Company that was on the corner of Union and Bellevue. And my aunt, who was a school teacher, she taught at Bellevue Junior High School, and I started out going to Bruce Elementary School, and they were all within half a block of each other. And so in the morning, when we pack up all of our lunches, we just get dropped off at our various places. And I guess I was 12 years old before we even had an automobile. And then, of course, about in those years, the Second World War had started, but it was a small, knit community, and of course pleasant for kids to play in the neighborhood and stuff.
As a child, were you aware of the segregation?
I really wasn't, certainly at all. When I was a child, I was actually raised in probably a terrible situation, some psychiatrists would say, in a home where I had start at the top, well, my father, of course, but a great-grandmother who had been married to someone, my great-grandfather, who'd been in the Civil War. So that was how close I was to way back. She was there, and she was elderly, of course, but still doing what she wanted to do. And then, so that was my great-grandmother. I had my grandmother, I had my mother, and I had my aunt, all of whom lived in the house with us, and I was sort of, got a lot of attention. And my sister came along, she did too. But, it was, we had a woman that lived with us in a guest house, which at that time was called a servant quarters. And she took care of me, cooked for the family, did the washing, and I recall got a day off, and I'd spend a lot of time with her. She'd take me on the trolley car downtown or whatever we were going to do. But that was, other than seeing someone come by the streets, maybe on a Saturday with a wagon selling, drawn by a mule or a horse, selling fruit or vegetables or things from the country. Those are about the only African Americans I saw, no kids, of course. And then even when I went to East High School after into high school age, and it was a new school out in East Memphis at that time. The school was completely segregated. You would begin to hear in junior high about people in another community, for instance, books into the school year when it got to be spring and school was out. The teachers would tell us, get all your books you've used all year and pile them up on the pavement out here. And I remember asking what was going to happen to the books, and they said, well, next year they go to the black schools, African American schools. And so I guess that was one of the first times that I had any sense that there was not only a segregated system, but a system of inequality. And the first time that I guess as a sort of becoming adult person that I had an awareness of that is I was running track at East High School, and all of my friends who were white held state records. They were the recognized record holders. And you couldn't run against the black schools. It was against the law for schools to compete against each other, white schools and black schools. But some Saturdays or Sundays, groups of us from all the schools, black and white, we would climb over the fence at something that was called Hodges Field, which was one of the old football stadiums, and it was closed on the weekends, but we knew how to get over the fence. And so we would run against each other just on our own, no coaches, no officials, nobody there. It wasn't a sanctioned group. And it struck me as strange that my white friends, that all of whom held these state records, were in fact getting beat by the black kids from schools like Booker T. Washington, Melrose, Carver. And yet, the next week, when the state records were reflected in the newspapers, these kids that were getting beat on Sunday afternoon were still the record holders, because there was not even any recognition given to the black athletes in the traditionally white press. So that certainly was another time that I began to sense that I was living in what people in South Africa might call an apartheid situation. And of course, as I said, I've never been anywhere. I didn't know what it was like anywhere else. And I came to Rhodes, Southwestern in 1954. And the only reason I got to come here is that I was running track at East High. We didn't have a track, so my coach would put me in his car or the back of his motorcycle or whatever it was and drive me over to the cinder track here at Rhodes. And I began to run with the Rhodes College kids and was able to do well enough that the coach went to whoever was in the business office and arranged for me to get a leadership scholarship, for that, which I think was about 80% athletic and about 20% student government and all the other things. But when I came to Rhodes, of course, it was completely segregated as well. No black kids here at all. And it was not until about 1956 when I went to represent the college at a national student meeting in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that I met contemporary kids my own age, African Americans, and actually had, with the athletes, we'd run against each other on these secret meets, but I'd never had any real intellectual exchange of information with anyone that was not white. And then the next summer, Jameson Jones, who was a dean here when I was here, arranged for me to go to Europe, study, and have a broad experience of kids from all over the country who were doing the same thing. I got a scholarship to participate in that. And then again, I met African-American students from Harvard or Yale or University of California or wherever, which again was sort of a major step for me in my understanding of the world being bigger than what I'd grown up in Memphis.
Did you feel that after having those experiences, like being at the track or meeting students of color at the National Student Association, did you feel that as a student or an athlete, you had been disadvantaged at the Black community's disadvantages? Like as an effect of segregation, you as a student had been disadvantaged because you had been isolated from their academic knowledge or their contribution to athletics?
You know, I don't know that I ever even thought, certainly at that point, I never thought about it because those were sort of three little spots over a long period of time. And I was still not competing. Like when I'm running here at Rhodes, I never was competing with any African-American athletes. I think there was certainly a sense, if you thought about it, as if the playing field was broader, that your status in the formation would not be nearly as high. Of course, that had been the same case if I was running at Rhodes or the University of Pennsylvania or Stanford. You know, everything is relative, but I don't really think I had the feeling of what you're describing until I actually got involved in community stuff and politics and began to see how sort of retarded or set back Memphis and Memphians and all of us throughout the South, and I guess really all over the country, had been, and that the white community had suffered in many, many ways from the segregated system. And the most important part of that is we'd sort of set in motion lifestyle that had picked up from slavery and sharecrop farmers to poverty, and the segregated system made the economic segregation appear. And so places like Memphis had a very limited economy, which was dependent upon black labor, low wages, even to the extent that the city fought very hard against unions, which would have brought higher wages because the white businesses wanted to keep the wages low and wanted to resist union pressure. And you'd have companies like Firestone, International Harvester, Ford Motor Company, where there was a lot of labor effort to raise the status of the black wage earner. And, you know, Memphis still pays the price in our schools and economy and everything else of that economically segregated system.
Were there any other experiences that you had here at Southwestern that influenced you later in your life?
Yeah, I was president of the student body here, and as a result of that, you know, I got very involved in issues that were a little bit bigger than just the college issues, and began to work with students across the country and things like, I mean, these are such ancient history, nobody remember it now, but 1956 or so, the Hungarians in Budapest rebelled or revolted against the Russian communist control. Students were very, very instrumental in that revolution that sort of temporarily, for a short period of time, resulted in sort of new freedoms in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and there was a lot of discussion there, and even there was some, as we talked about it, similarities that we could see when you compared sort of a free Czech or Hungarian who wanted to resist the communist control sort of from outside to the African American in the South. And of course, I'm talking about 1956, and you get into the early 60s, and you began to translate what's happening in those countries, what Gandhi's doing in India with nonviolent civil disobedience, moral force issues to resist tyranny or oppression or inequities. And that began to translate as we worked on things into the civil rights movement. And I remember when I was president of the student body, I set up something, we called it the intercollegiate student government, which would have representatives from Rhodes, CBU, Lemoyne-Owen, University of Memphis, and we would meet, and that would allow at least Lemoyne-Owen, which was the African American college, to have interplay with students in other places. So those things began to happen, and of course Little Rock Central in those years, middle 50s, you had the federal troops coming in, and those issues, sit-ins around the South beginning to develop. So I remember writing one of my senior dissertation papers here at Rhodes on sort of comparing sort of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s leadership characters with the 1950s, what they call white citizens councils throughout the South. Sort of what was the real difference, if any, but what happened in all those years, and there frankly wasn't much.
Well, after you graduated Rhodes, what helped you decide your career path?
Just luck. Kind of like luck. I got to go to, if I hadn't run track over here in the spring of 54, I would have gone probably to the Army because my family didn't have enough money for me to go to college. Otherwise, Rhodes gave me a scholarship, and then they allowed me to work for a man named Mr. Rollo, who was the college engineer. And I also worked at the library, but mainly the dining hall. Just didn't have any money, and back in those days, your parents weren't sort of expected if they didn't have money to pay, and no one ever heard of a student loan borrowing money. So I was pretty much working and had a scholarship and got through, and I came into my senior year, and of course was crazy about Rhodes and faculty and the experience I had had here, and got a grant or fellowship to go to Duke and get a PhD in political science, which was my major here. And I had tried to get a Rhodes Scholarship in political science and economics, and sort of got up through the chain to the last steps, but then either wasn't a good enough athlete or a good enough student to take the last step. And but I thought, I was pretty that being a professor would be good. And in the spring again, this time 58, 4 years later, one of the part-time coaches of the track team was a guy named Ross Pritchard, who started the International Studies Department here at Rhodes College. And Dr. Pritchard had been a All-American football player at Arkansas, played for the Washington Redskins. He was very attractive, vibrant, exciting teacher, and he sort of helped, as teachers, professors do here, they get involved with the kids and help them outside their own little area, and he was talking to me and asked me what I was going to do when I graduated, and I told him I was going to be a professor, and he said, well, why don't be all right, but what if you don't like teaching after you've gone through the whole PhD program, you've gotten your doctorate, and you decide teaching is not something you like? And I said, well, I'd be a mess. And he said, well, why don't you go to law school? And that way you can teach if you want to in law school, or if you want to practice law or be more involved in the community, you can do that. You don't have to make that choice right now. You can keep that option open. So that made sense to me. And so I changed, and I think in the process got dumped by this girl that I was pinned to that I thought I was going to marry, because she had in her mind that she's going to be married to a college professor. When I swapped over to a lawyer, she didn't know much about well, that sounded quite as good. There are probably other reasons too, but I know that was a factor. And so I scrambled around and luckily got a good scholarship at the University of Virginia and went there.
And where are you currently employed?
I'm at Burch, Porter & Johnson, which is a law firm here in Memphis that was started in 1904, so 103 years ago. Originally by a man by the name of Charles Burch. His nephew, Lucius Burch, was the Burch that hired me to come back here. But Charles Burch was the lawyer for Rhodes College back in, 1928, when the college moved from Clarksville to Memphis, and actually had to defend the Rhodes president, Dr. Deal, who was charged by the presbytery with heresy. And they tried to remove him from office because they claimed his religious stance wasn't Presbyterian appropriate. But the whole deal behind the lawsuit or the challenge was they didn't want him to move the college to Memphis from Clarksville. His feeling was unless the college moved from Clarksville to Memphis, it wouldn't survive because Clarksville wasn't a big enough place it needed Memphis to do that. And so Charles Burch, the founder of my firm, represented Dr. Deal and got him off in that trial, and so we've represented Rhodes since 1928 or whatever it was.
What brought you back to Memphis?
This guy Lucius Burch that I probably just talked about again. Always make these decisions early and then renege on them. Just like I was going to go to Duke, it changed my mind. When I was at Virginia in my last year fall, I took a job or accepted a position with a big firm in Philadelphia, and then came home, and during the course of Thanksgiving holiday, I met with Lucius, who I clerked for the previous summer, and he convinced me that I didn't want to go, just like Ross Preacher convinced me I didn't want to go to Duke. He convinced me I didn't want to go to Philadelphia, and that what I ought to do would be to come back and work for him here in Memphis, because mainly sort of the service aspect that I didn't need much encouragement about, because Rhodes kind of brainwashes you into that service thing pretty solidly. His idea was if you go to Philadelphia, you're just going to be sort of one among many Philadelphia people, but if you come to Memphis, you'll be someone that not only has grown up here, understands the community, but also understands what a lawyer could do to change the community. And of course, you have to remember that was 1961. John Kennedy had just been elected president. His brother, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General. I had worked for John Kennedy in his campaign. I had toyed with going to work for the Justice Department in Washington at that time, and the Civil Rights Movement was just beginning. Lucius was representing people and working with the newspapers to try to desegregate the Memphis libraries. We had segregated drinking fountains. Movies were segregated. African Americans could only go to the zoo one day a week. Just the whole structure was still segregated in many, many ways, but it was changing, and there were a lot of new African Americans who had returned from service in the Second World War and Korean War, and they were beginning to not tolerate the current strata here in Memphis, and Lucius, being sort of a liberal type person, was the lawyer that they would sort of go to help make these changes. And so I immediately sort of got involved carrying his briefcase and doing those kinds of things, and that led to representing people that were working in voter registration drives and lunch counter sit-ins and things like that. As a matter of fact, one of the most significant things that I remember is, again, still being a runner, I'd come back and I was running out on the track even after I'd started practicing law here in Memphis. And that was the first year that there were two African Americans admitted to Rhodes College or Southwestern. And one of these youngsters was a young man named Lorenzo Childress, and he was an end on the football team. And they were out working in their summer practice, whatever, pre-fall workouts. And there was a restaurant that all the football players went to that was over at the corner of Parkway and, Parkway there at where East and North Parkway, Summer, I guess, is joined. Named maybe the Steakhouse or something like that. So all these football players, after practice, walked over. They were staying in the dorms here in the summer. Walked over to the restaurant to have dinner, and the guy running the restaurant said the white players could come in, but Lorenzo Childress couldn't come with them. So to their credit, they refused to go in. None of them went in, and somehow they got in touch with me, and we filed a lawsuit under then. There were these interstate commerce, anti-discrimination. You couldn't do that anymore, but a lot of people in Memphis didn't want to pay attention to that law. So we ended up, that restaurant closed before they would serve a black person, and so it just went out of business before we closed that down. And then there were other lawsuits like that, some school desegregation things. It sort of went along that way during my early years, even though I was having to spend most of my time still making a living and doing what lawyers do.
Were there any other memorable cases that stick out in your mind from the civil rights period?
Well, of course, the most memorable was came 7 years later when we were hired to represent Dr. King when he was killed here in Memphis. And that is another story. One of these people that I had met over the years through these sit-ins in Nashville and North Carolina, there was a young minister who was a young man who had been a divinity student at Vanderbilt. And he had gone, as part of his divinity work, to India to study under Gandhi, the nonviolent movement, moral force, or civil disobedience, whatever you call it. When he came back, Dr. King was starting his campaigns, and Jim Lawson was very instrumental in sort of teaching Dr. King how you set up what Gandhi had done, whether it was marches. Gandhi was, of course, using it against the British to get independence or equity, and King was using it against the whites to get more equity and fairness. And so Jim was involved in those sit-ins in the bus when they take blacks and whites and put them on an interstate bus and go to Selma, Alabama, or Anniston. You had all the violence, and the bus buses set on fire, and all that stuff that's going on in the South. And so Lawson knew King from that experience, and he was a minister at this time here in Memphis. This was after he had been arrested on one of these buses down in Anniston, Alabama. He was arrested for disturbing the peace when his bus was set on fire, and he was beat by these thugs down there himself. But of course the locals arrested him for disturbing the peace, for being on the bus that set up all this trouble. And when he did that, really strange thing, the chancellor of Vanderbilt expelled him for this arrest. And when that happened, the majority of the divinity school faculty at Vanderbilt resigned in protest to what the chancellor had done to Lawson. And so Lawson ended up going to Boston, wherever King went to divinity school, Boston College maybe, Boston University, I don't know, one of those. And he graduated, got his divinity degree, and came back to Memphis and had a church called Centenary Methodist Church. And so at that time, there was a big garbage strike going on in Memphis, sanitation workers, and it went on for months and months and was not getting very far. And Lawson had the idea of bringing King into Memphis to lead a big demonstration in behalf of the sanitation workers to try to get their better rights and economic benefits, which were sorely needed. And so King agreed to come, and in March, this would be March of 1968, latter part, King came and led a march, but the march was broken up with some kids, took placards off of sticks that the placards were on, and began at the corner of sort of Beale and Main to knock windows out, break windows. Some looting started, the police reacted, tear gas, some people got shot, people got killed. King was taken away to safety, and that night he had a press conference and said, I'm going to come back to Memphis and I'm going to have another march, and it's going to be safe, and we're going to get results, and we're not going to let this prevent us from doing it. Well, when he did that, the city went to federal court and got an injunction to restrain King from coming back and having a march. And they had the good evidence that the last time they had a march, it was turned violent. So when he announced that, and the city went to federal court, they got the injunction, and King said he didn't care, he's going to march anyway. But a lot of the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Council, people that were more concerned about the ramifications of Dr. King violating a federal court injunction, when throughout the movement, the African American community and the civil rights community were using federal court injunctions to integrate schools, to allow progress to be made. And this wasn't just an injunction by some state judge down in a little town in Mississippi or Alabama. This was a federal court, and the federal courts were the big support mechanism for the whole civil rights movement, the Justice Department, everything that we were doing with voting rights, segregation laws, and everything else. And so those people, including the ACLU, didn't want to get that injunction lifted, and so they called me to see if I would represent Dr. King to go to court and get that lifted. And as I said, I'd only been practicing law 7 years, and so I knew I was not prime time yet, and so I had to go to Lucius, the guy who brought me into this in the first place, and get him to represent Dr. King, and he agreed eventually to do that. And we met with Dr. King the night before he was killed, and were in court all the day. The day he was killed, we got the injunction lifted, and when I took Andy Young, who was, along with Jim Lawson, our two witnesses in that hearing, back to the Lorraine Motel, before I could drive home, Dr. Andy Young was just a sort of a chief aide to Dr. King, along with Abernathy and Jesse Jackson and others. But he later became the United States ambassador to the UN and became mayor of Atlanta for several terms.
That's such a good story. After the first strike, sanitation workers strike, and then having the injunction lifted to have the second strike, can you describe the socio-political aftermath in Memphis? What the sentiments of the community, the Memphians, were feeling at that point?
Well, it was almost a sort of day-by-day situation. If you go back, the sentiments a week before the hearing, week before King was killed, tremendous racial polarization. A lot of people thought King was a communist. The FBI was doing everything they could to sort of bump him off the track in any way that they could. A lot of hate in Memphis against any, uppity black leader, particularly someone like Dr. King, that was getting results. And so you would have certainly found very little, if any, sympathy for Dr. King and the movement within the broad white community. Again, that segregation and the two lines were pretty separated. However, I think the city, two things happened when King was shot. One, a lot of people that felt like they shouldn't have been sitting on the fence. They should have been involved trying to get the strike settled and to get a fair playing field for everybody here in Memphis and in the South. They sort of had sort of remorse about positions they had taken. And there was sort of an immediate sort of interracial groups that were sort of formed after that to try to say, how can we keep this thing from happening again? How much of it was sort of just an embarrassment that Memphis had been where King was killed, and how much of it was, I think it was a lot of all of those things. But as Andy Young told me when I had a lunch with him maybe 3 or 4 months ago in Atlanta, and he said he can hardly think of Memphis because of the trauma of standing by Dr. King when his head was blown off. And yet he said, but for that fact, we never would have made the progress that we did make, because King's death, just like Gandhi's death, just like Robert Kennedy's death, just like John Kennedy's death, made them bigger than life. And so it allowed people to sort of do things in their wake to make changes that probably would not have happened if they hadn't become martyrs, in a sense. And I've always felt like, and of course, later on I became United States Attorney, where I had access to all the FBI files and the records, and I was Attorney General, where I saw all of the case against James Earl Ray, and who killed King, and all of that. And it was pretty obvious that it was just complete happenstance that King was shot here in Memphis. Ray had been tracking him through Montgomery and Birmingham and Atlanta, and just looking for the right opportunity where he could get a shot at him. And it just turned out that occasion was here in Memphis. He was at the Lorraine Motel, and Ray could find a flop house right across the street that he had a good angle for a shot, or shots.
Do you remember it being a difficult decision for your firm to make in representing Dr. King?
Well, it wasn't a difficult thing for me to make. I'm sure that there was some feeling within the firm that this is going to be costly in terms of economics. Lucius, when I talked to him, one of the conditions that he had for representing Dr. King was he wanted Dr. King to sit down with him and tell him why this march was so important to the big picture and to Dr. King and the civil rights movement, and why it was necessary for someone like Burch and our firm to get in to help them get this injunction lifted. And that sort of led to the discussion where Lucius and I and a couple of other lawyers went down the day before King was killed, and sat with him at the Lorraine Motel and heard Burch ask those questions like we're sitting here now. Burch would say, all right, tell me why I ought to get into this, and King tell him, all the stories about black power, and a lot of young people were losing confidence in the civil disobedience method, and they wanted to get guns, and he was determined to, like Gandhi, to not let it resort to violence, because that would defeat what everyone had really ever been trying to do, and that is to show this moral force. And I think Burch, way back in his mind, was sort of saying, I know that a lot of the clients in this firm are not going to be happy about us doing it. We're going to lose some of this business, and I just want to make sure that it's not just of no consequence to the bigger picture. I don't think we ever lost anything to any degree. Later on, I think we did lose a whole lot more business when we helped some guy named Arlo Smith, who was a biology professor here at Rhodes, and some little old ladies in tennis shoes to stop the interstate I-40 from going through over to the park. I think the firm got a lot more sort of adverse business pressure and discomfort from the legal community or the business community than we did really from Dr. King. Now, that could have been different, though, if Dr. King had not been killed. You see, things changed. Today we've got a national holiday. People take the day off all over the country for Dr. King. Every city has a street, Martin Luther King Boulevard or whatever else, postage stamps, whatever. But back then, he was certainly did not have that position in anyone's mind.
Do you feel as if Dr. King's nonviolent approach to leadership affected you as a leader in Memphis at the time?
Well, of course, the whole idea was, I would have felt the same, I think, about Gandhi and what he was doing. Again, if you, these bumper stickers, you say, what would Jesus do, or whatever it is. If you go through Rhodes College 4 years and you have philosophy, religious, history, government professors that sort of tell you sort of what's the right way. Do you want to be Machiavelli, or do you want to be Gandhi? Or, how do you sort of solve problems, or how do you approach things? I was sort of ready for all of that. It just fit into the way that I thought was the right way to do it. It was very, back in those days when I was here in the 50s, people like Jameson Jones, who taught senior Bible, they stuffed down you. All the existentialist writers, the theologians that were like Tillich and Rollo May or Camus or Sartre or Buber or Heidegger, all of those folks would have been very comfortable, I think, with the idea that a person has an obligation, or it's part of being a human, to try to change situations that are inequitable. That's service. I mean, whether it's helping an elderly person get a meal, or is it trying to reform a structure in government to make it so that a vote counts, or that all, there is certainly, you could call any kind of things, Presbyterian, Rhodes, service, existential, I don't know, all of those things sort of made it easy for me to feel that that was what I wanted to do, rather than sort of make a lot of money being a lawyer. Not that I didn't have to support a family and do the things everybody else has to do.
Who do you consider to be some of your role models from your life?
This fella, Jameson Jones, one for certain, who was the dean here, and then later after he left here, it was president of the Art Academy, Memphis Academy of Arts, that's near here in the park. He was certainly a major factor. And then this guy, Burch, that was the lawyer mentor, who was, he was not only a tremendous figure for change in the civil rights movement in this area, but toward the latter part of his life, the whole environmental area. Another thing that we were involved in as a law firm is, I don't know who's our audience here, but there's something called Shelby Farms, which is a huge park, bigger than Central Park, that's right, eventually it'll be right in the middle of Memphis, or the living area of Memphis. All of a sudden the city, which was in sort of a hard budget time, was going to sell all that land to real estate developers to put homes out there. And Lucius and others formed a group and filed litigation and stopped that and preserved it as a park. And now, 30 years later, or however many years, we've just worked with the current groups that are doing that to form a conservatorship or a conservancy out there to preserve it as a parkland, so that in bad times or whatever, people can't start putting a golf course or McDonald's or whatever else out there, and it'll be maintained as a public resource. So Lucius was very, and those woods out there are named for him. Lucius Burch Wildlife Area is named for Lucius.
Well, do you think things have changed today from how they were in that period?
Sure, they've changed. Maybe 180 degrees would be too big. And a lot of the problems are there. They're, in a sense, there for either different reasons, or they're there because we've never overcome the sort of basic problems that were in the origin of slavery, poor education, the fact that African Americans weren't allowed to even go to school or read or whatever else for many years after slavery, and then not allowed economically to prosper. But you have to admit that in a city like Memphis, you've got banks, you've got big businesses, you've got successful lawyers, you've got African Americans who are real achievers, economically outstanding. But even what used to be sort of segregation on race, we still have a lot of class segregation, in the sense that your upper class, upper middle class African Americans in Memphis now are living in the white suburbs and have left what used to be the segregated African American neighborhoods in North and South Memphis, and have left those communities without any mentors, without any successful role models, and the economic condition of those housing areas or residential areas in the what you would call inner city are probably, in a sense, economically not even as good as the African American segregated communities were when the black male in the African American family had a good paying job at Firestone or International Harvester or some of the, you don't have lower middle class African American males that have an economic outlet to support themselves. And I think that has been part of the destruction of the lower class black family, because the black male has no part to play anymore of that. There's no feeling of responsibility. There are so many families that don't have a male in the family anymore. And that, of course, is a change for the worst. And I think in the past, where those of us in the white community had to sort of pitch in and decide how we can solve these problems because the black community leadership was powerless to do it by themselves. I think in a sense now the white leadership or the white community in a sense is not going to be able to solve those problems. It's going to take the black community solving those problems for themselves and then raising the economic level of the entire community. I mean, that's more complicated than we're going to get through in this little interview today.
Well, that almost answers the last question of who in today's Memphis do you feel has the most potential to change the community, and that's, you're saying, coming from the African American communities themselves.
Yeah. Well, certainly the one that's way up at the top is the county mayor, A.C. Wharton, who has run countywide and attracted majorities in both the black and the white community. That's obviously the answer. Interesting enough, another Rhodes graduate, Herman Morris, just ran this year, 2007, for city mayor. And in that race, there was a strong African-American candidate, the mayor, Willie Harrington, and Herman was the African-American contester, but then there was a white candidate as well, and the more strident, simply black candidate was successful over Herman Morris, who was trying to find a place in the center where he would get black and white support. You could say that's a significant thing, but when I ran for mayor 25 years ago to this date, in 1982, I ran against a city council chairman who was African American and a very conservative white candidate. And I was, like Herman Morris, I was in the middle trying to attract black and white support because, again, it was my idea that we're not going to solve problems here in Memphis until we start electing people that have black and white voters supporting them. But in that case, the percentages sort of that I got in the middle were about the same that Herman Morris got 25 years later. But the difference is that in the 1982 election, there was a runoff provision. So since the white candidate got about 5% more of the white vote than I did, and I'd gotten no black support, but the black candidate got all the black support, there was a runoff then. And so the runoff was between the black candidate and the conservative white candidate, and then Memphis was still majority white, and so the white candidate was elected and served until our current African-American mayor beat him in a race which was white candidate got 99% of the white vote, black candidate got 99% of the black vote, but at that point in Memphis history, the demographics were there were enough blacks to make a majority, so the white candidate then beat. But, you know, the answer is to get away someday from having people get elected because of whether they're black or white. And we're moving toward that. It'll happen.
And do you think it'll happen in my lifetime, your lifetime?
Yeah, it'll happen in a number of elections. It just has to break right. You know, for instance, you know, anytime you've got multiple candidates, you have to, it sort of throws a monkey wrench into it. But there'll certainly be good African-American candidates that will get a substantial white vote. I don't have any doubt about that. And there'll be, you know, the other way too. I think it'll be better.
Well, is there anything you'd like to add on that we haven't covered in the interview so far?
No, just how much I always enjoy coming back to Rhodes. It was, I wouldn't have had all the opportunities and interesting things that I've gotten to fool with if I hadn't fallen into coming to school here.
Well, I know Rhodes certainly enjoys having you come back. So thank you so much again for your time.